Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Kody Blois. I'm the Member of Parliament for King's Hants in Nova Scotia, and I have the privilege of serving as the chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food. And I was asked to help facilitate a joint press conference today for 4 different national stakeholders. And I accepted because I know that the agriculture stakeholders assembled here today want to share their respective concerns for what a prolonged disruption of rail service by Canadian Pacific would mean for their respective commodity groups. Right now, the Agriculture Committee is studying supply chains vis-a-vis the agriculture sector. And we know that there have been vulnerabilities stemming from COVID-19 for the past 2 years, and that a disruption of service right now is compounding impact to the challenges farmers and ranchers have seen and have already endured for the past 2 years. I would like to thank the 4 stakeholder groups who are here today. Certainly as members of Parliament, we have the opportunity to work with them directly to understand the concerns of farmers, of producers. So thank you for your ongoing advocacy and your work, and I know that your message today will be important to highlight your respective concerns. Je vais répéter juste très rapidement en français. Bonjour à tous, merci d'être ici aujourd'hui. Je m'appelle Kody Blois, je suis le député de King's Hants en Nouvelle-Écosse et le président du comité permanent de l'agriculture et agroalimentaire de la Chambre des communes. On m'a demandé d'aider à animer la conférence de presse conjointe aujourd'hui et j'ai accepté parce que je sais que les parties prenantes du secteur agricole réunis ici aujourd'hui veulent partager leurs préoccupations respectives quant aux conséquences de l'interruption prolongée du service de transport par chemin de fer de Canada Pacifique sur les groupes des produits respectifs. À l'heure actuelle, le Comité de l'agriculture et agroalimentaire a étudié la chaîne d'approvisionnement du secteur agricole et nous savons qu'il existe des vulnérabilités résultant de COVID-19 et qu'une interruption de service ne ferait qu'aggraver les difficultés que l'agriculture et les éleveurs ont déjà endurées au cours des 2 dernières années. Je tiens à remercier les 4 groupes intervenants présents aujourd'hui pour leur travail dans l'intérêt de l'agriculture canadien. Et je passe le micro pour Bob Lowe, the president of the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. I'll be present certainly after the remarks from the 4 stakeholders for any questions from the media, but I'm going to turn it over now to Bob Lowe, who is the president of the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, for his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Kody, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm Bob Lowe, and I need my glasses. And I'm the president of the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. Today we're gathered with other agriculture stakeholders to emphasize our shared concern about the work stoppage at CP Rail and our request for the immediate introduction of back-to-work legislation. As you know, this past year Canadian farmers and ranchers had a difficult growing season with one of the widest spread droughts in history stretching from the Great Lakes all the way to British Columbia. This has meant that to feed our cattle we've been dependent on importing feed from the United States via CP Rail. We already have experienced with the significant impact disruptions in rail can have on our producers, as this January, due to Omicron and cold weather, trains were delayed, and this resulted in severe feed shortages and some cattle producers coming within hours of running out of feed. Although trains have been running this past number of weeks, we have not been able to build a stockpile of feed, and currently we only have a 1 to 2 week buffer of feed in the system before we won't have any feed for our cattle. I would also note that there are not enough trucks available to transport the feed. It is estimated that over 1,000 Super B trucks would be needed weekly to replace the volume of feed grain currently being transported by CP trains, and trucking capacity is not available, leaving no alternative solutions. That is why we've been consistently urging the negotiating parties to reach a resolution, and today, following yesterday's work stoppage, have to ask the federal government to intervene and implement back-to-work legislation immediately. Time is very sensitive, and we are urging MPs and senators to address this through back-to-work legislation with urgency. I'll now pass over to my colleague, Erin Gowriluk, and we'll take questions at the end.
Thank you, Bob, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erin Gowriluk, and I'm the Executive Director with the Grain Growers of Canada. And our organization provides a strong national voice for 65,000 active and successful grain, oilseed, and pulse producers. I would like to shed some light today on the impact that this work stoppage is going to have on our members. To be frank, for grain growers, the railways represent a lifeline. They rely on this vital connection for several reasons, not the least of which are to receive critical deliveries of fertilizer and other inputs required to put a crop in the ground as we head into a crucial spring planting season. As our farmers prepare for spring, they're still experiencing the fallout from last year's disappointing growing season. On a farm, cash flow is king, and the railways represent the only way to bring back what little remains of last year's grain to market and support what we hope will be a bounce-back season for Canadian crops. The impact of this work stoppage compounds the particularly vulnerable position that farmers already find themselves in. Our agri-food system generates over $55 billion annually, but with the fallout from the war in Ukraine, our international customers require quick reassurance that a spring crop will go in the ground without delays caused by supply chain interruptions. The bottom line is that our members rely on this critical infrastructure to get our product to customers across Canada and around the world. Therefore, we are calling on the federal government to use any tool at its disposal to bring this disruption to an end. Thank you, and I will now turn it over to my colleague, Clyde Graham.
Thank you, Erin. My name is Clyde Graham. I'm Executive Vice President at Fertilizer Canada. We are facing an urgent situation today, and joining our colleagues and our customers as well in the farming community share our concerns about the work stoppage at CP. Our request is for the federal government to take immediate action to mitigate the impacts on the supply chain. Disruption to essential rail service during the crucial spring seeding season, which is about to begin across the country, is already having devastating impacts on farmers, the economy, and domestic and international food security. It will only get worse every day we allow this work stoppage to continue. Fertilizer Canada respects the collective bargaining process, but we feel we have now reached a point where the government must intervene. Every day matters when it comes to ending this work stoppage. Fertilizer, which is food for plants, is the most important input for crops and is responsible for half of the world's current food production. Spring seeding is 4 to 6 weeks away in Canada, depending on the region, and even sooner in the United States, where we are a major exporter. Due to poor rail service leading into the spring season, Fertilizer Canada members are 2 to 3 weeks already behind on inventories and storage capacity at fertilizer production facilities. There is a brief window where farmers fertilize their crops at planting, and they are counting on a timely supply of fertilizer to maximize their yields, as Erin said, to make up for some of the losses due to drought last year. The agricultural sector is already experiencing supply challenges compounded by the war in Ukraine and cannot withstand any more disruption. The 2021 growing season saw lower crop yields due to weather conditions, and food security in Canada and internationally depends on maximizing crop yields this season. 75% of fertilizer products are shipped by rail, and at this time, we are only days away from curtailing production and shutting down facilities. This is very time sensitive, hours matter, and we are urging MPs and senators to address this through back to work legislation. I'll pass this over to my colleague, James Bekkering.
Thank you, Clyde. My name is James Bekkering. I'm currently the chair of National Cattle Feeders Association and also a feedlot producer from Southern Alberta. As you have heard earlier, last year's drought resulted in a significant lack of feed grain in Western Canada, and we have been relying heavily on alternative feed sources like imported corn and distillers grain as a result. For context, CP Rail in 2021 alone imported 8,100 cars of corn. In 2020, only 600 cars of corn were imported, And so far in 2022, we have exceeded the number from 2021. This stoppage is potentially detrimental to animal welfare in two ways. First, most cattle feeders have less than 2 weeks of existing feed supply, which currently consists of imported feed. Secondly, cattle require consistent diet, so are unable to simply change feed type based on what is available around them. In the last year and recently, many feeders have had to change their rations more than once to accommodate different feed sources. Each change means working closely with the nutritionist and introducing new feeds at a rate that won't impact animal health. Cattle cannot simply eat something new each week. This combination of factors could potentially result in cattle seeing reduced rations or improper nutrition, compromising animal health or leaving them hungry in the coming days and weeks to come until we have the supply chain restored. This stoppage needs an immediate resolution. As the longer there are delays, the longer it takes for the backlog to be sorted out and for feed to actually get to farms and feedlots. The health and welfare and well-being of cattle across Canada depends on consistent supply chain and transport, which has already been compromised for months, causing us to modify nutrition significantly to ensure our animals are being well fed. I'd like to thank you to all my industry colleagues who have spoke here today, and especially to Member of Parliament Blois for hosting us here today, and I believe I'll turn it back to him at this point in time.
Thank you very much. That ends the formal remarks portion of the press conference. I believe we have at least one person in the room vis-a-vis the media and perhaps some online. So I think the way this goes is state your publication and name, and you can ask questions of any of us.
First question in the room, please. And for the reporters online, please use the raise hand function if you have a question. Thank you.
Hey there, yeah, David Baxter from Global News, and this question would be really for any of the heads of the various stakeholder groups we have here. Just on the way into question period today, politicians from all parties kind of danced around the issue of back to work legislation. No one really gave a clear answer whether to be for it. When asked directly, just what do any of you make of that stance from MPs of all parties really not saying whether or not they'd be in favor of back to work?
I could try.
Yeah, for sure.
Sure. Well, I can't sort of speak for members of parliament or senators. I'm hopeful that that equivocation is an attempt to respect the collective bargaining process, and that when the time comes, which is now, to implement back to work legislation, that the politicians and the senators in Parliament will act quickly and decisively.
And especially sorry, I'm drawing a blank on your name right now.
Clyde
but
Graham, yeah.
There we go. But yeah, especially since just give us a bit more of just some background on just the dire situation for fertilizer right now. If we aren't seeing timely rail shipments, since of course much of the world's potash does come from Saskatchewan, but Russia is also one of the major suppliers, and with all the sanctions, that's just going to limit that resource so much. So can you give us an idea of just what the downstream impact here could be if we see a prolonged rail backlog?
Yeah. So the geopolitical situation is dire. As we all been following Ukraine, we follow very much support the efforts of the government to support the people of Ukraine as our industry does. But certainly the loss of grains and oilseeds coming out of Russia and the Ukraine because of the war there will endanger food security around the world. The last thing we need at this point is a rail strike or lockout in Canada to disrupt efforts to get fertilizer to Canadian farmers, but also potash and other fertilizers to farmers around the world, and also to produce a sufficient crop to try to backfill the loss of production in Eastern Europe. Do you want to?
Just to add a little bit from the cattle side, COVID, as everybody knows, has caused a whole bunch of things to go wrong. And we've suffered, through a drought, we've suffered through shortages, or CP rail slowing down because of Omicron and because of cold weather and things. This could be the most devastating thing that we've seen, and it's human caused. And from our point of view, it's very easy for humans to fix this problem. And we, as everybody here said, we don't have a lot of time. So thank you.
I'll remind you once again, if you're a reporter online, please use the raise hand function if you have a question.
Mr. Lowe, since you were just talking about having about like 1 to 2 weeks of feed in storage right now, just can you give us just an idea of just for people watching who may be unfamiliar with cattle feed, just like how dire a situation are we talking here if we aren't seeing the trains starting to roll before too long, and why CN can't just cover the holes?
Because I think CN is already booked.
There we go.
Roughly, I don't know the answer to that, but it's not that we have alternate food supplies to go to for cattle. There isn't any. Because of the drought, we just didn't produce any, or we wouldn't be importing all this corn. I think James said the amount compared to other years is phenomenal. We're one of the U.S.'s biggest corn markets right now, and that's totally because of the drought, and totally because we don't have a plan B. When you're relying on corn to come from as far away as it's coming, or feed to come from as far away as it's coming, the logistics of building up a supply into the future, there's just not enough capacity to make that happen. So we're at a hand-to-mouth situation, and that's why it's critical to get this thing moving.
Just one last question, just a more general one for anyone who wants to answer. Just you've all talked a bit about it, just COVID, whether it's COVID work disruptions, the droughts, other extreme weather events. Now, war in Russia and war in Ukraine. We're seeing the potential rail backlogs again, which also could turn into shipping backlogs down the line, depending on how long this goes. With ships just not being able to unload their supply in port necessarily. Just heading into another growing season, just what's going through your minds right now? Because it seems like has to have been, for exterior factors, it's like some of the worst consecutive year after year in agriculture.
I think to your point, that's exactly why we just can't handle another challenge. The sector, whether you're on the livestock side or our grain producers across the country, have just been facing one challenge after another. And so this is their one effort from the grains perspective to try and recover from last year's drought. And I think we have to remember that with respect to your first question around whether or not CN can fill any of those gaps, not every farmer has access to that rail line. And so if you're dependent on CP, for example, you're dependent on CP. And if the trains aren't moving, you're not getting the product that you need. And for every week that we're offline, we're going to take a month to recover from that backlog. So that's why when we talk about hours mattering, it really does. It's so critical, because for every day that this work stoppage continues, we're going to take an entire week to recover from that. And from the livestock perspective, as Bob already indicated, if you've only got a week or two in the system with respect to feed, then hours matter. And our farmers are out ready for spring planting at this point, and so they can't afford any further delays.
I know the question was directed towards the producers, but as I've sat and listened to the three questions, I want to give a perspective as a member of Parliament. I think fundamentally why this press conference was important was to allow stakeholders to be able to talk about the consequences of a prolonged strike and what it means. I'm quite confident that members of Parliament across the House understand the implications and how impactful this is and how problematic it is. Our Minister of Labour right now, Seamus O'Regan, is in Calgary. He's on the ground. There's been federal mediators as part of that process. I think it was said that members of Parliament certainly want to be mindful of protecting the collective bargaining process. But at the same time, there is a collective interest here vis-a-vis the fact that we've just gone through COVID. There has been, as I've noted and others have noted, supply chain impacts. And then the war in Ukraine is creating a whole new dynamic. And Canada, in my view, and I believe in others' view as well, has a responsibility to be there, not only for our own food security, but for global food security. And so at this time, I think that this government knows exactly what's at stake. It's not unprecedented. You heard some of the stakeholders calling for back-to-work legislation. that has happened before in circumstances similar to this. I don't want to speak for the minister today, but I do want to make sure and reiterate as a member of parliament in the governing caucus that this government takes serious with what's happening right now.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference.
Thank you.